Right. Welcome everyone. I am Dr. Joe Graves, North Carolina A&T State University. I am standing in today for your long-term host of Club Ed Med, Dr. Charlie Nunn of Duke University. So welcome again to Club Ed Med Conversations. Our goal is to connect the evolutionary medicine community and share exciting new research. We try to have these sessions as informal as possible with an emphasis on discussion and presentation of different perspectives. And that's why we call it Club Ev Med Conversations. Now, Club Ev Med is organized by the International Society for Evolution Medicine and Public Health. If you are an ongoing member, now is a great time to renew your membership. If you are not a member of our society, let me invite you to consider becoming a member, because you will get great scholarly material like that's you're going to hear today by our good colleague, Dr. Brandon Ogbunu. Now, please also support the society by submitting articles to the society's journal, Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health. Now, Club Ev Med is also organized by 6 evolutionary medicine centers and programs, which Johnny Ullman should be putting in the chat right now, which I can't actually see. So let me tell you a little bit about the process. We're going to hope that you will participate in the conversation, post questions and perspectives in the chat box during the presentation, and that sets the stage for the discussion that follows. Raise your hand virtually to ask a question anytime, and we will call on you after the presentation. And certainly feel free to tweet about this session using hashtag ClubEvMed. Now, today we're going to have a series of 3 talks on evolutionary perspectives on health disparities. So Johnny should also be placing the details of the other 2 talks in the chat. Now, with that said, I have the distinct honor of introducing my young colleague, Dr. Brandon Ogbunu. Now, if Brandon says anything that upsets you during the next few minutes, you can blame it on me. Because Brandon once told me that he decided to pursue evolutionary biology as a career after hearing me give a seminar at the NIH. Now, with that as your impetus to become a scholar, you really can't blame the person, because I've never really been a good role model. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Dr. Brandon Ogbunu, an assistant professor of evolutionary biology at Yale University.
What a tremendous introduction for multiple reasons. It's topically kind of related to what we're going to talk about with regards to causes and and consequences and the sorts of things that we connect and look to explain complicated biological phenomena, and that includes the careers that we choose. And that anecdote is absolutely true. The professor was giving the talks for his, kind of award-winning book, Emperor's New Clothes, and I saw that while I was doing research at the NIH, and it completely changed my life and career. And at that point, I mean, we'll have the career conversation later or never, but I think those dimensions. I think I've carried that lecture in my head for many reasons, because it kind of influenced the way that I talk about what I talk about and why I do it. So just to make sure everybody's okay, you do see the slide, correct? A title slide. Good. All right. I don't want you to see my notes with all the swearing and all of those details. First off, thank you to the organizers. I gave it one of these 3 years ago during the the lockdown era, and it's remarkable how this lecture series has persisted and has remained incredibly popular. Really, almost, I don't know what the numbers are, but it seems to be about to the degree it was during the pandemic when everybody was virtual. And so, I love the little bit of a throwback for me to be able to put on the dorky gaming headphones and to be able to give a seminar with wearing basketball shorts. I kind of missed that era a little bit of academia, so this kind of takes me back there. I'm thrilled to kind of kick off a set of seminars that we're going to talk about this kind of health disparities focus of evolutionary medicine. And I think this format is going to be a very, very useful one for me. I was told about 20 minutes, of which I've already used about 5, but I was told about 20 minutes. And I think that's really, really great and dangerous for me. It's like enough time for me to get myself into trouble, but not enough time to get myself out of it. So I think, which is kind of part of the point. But I think disparity as identifiability, the social determinants of health, and a new direction for evolutionary medicine. And this, I'm going to fold in kind of both my, a little bit about my research program and my perspective, and also my role as, an associate editor, and my role as the editor for the special issue, and just somebody who thinks about this topic. So in some ways, what you're going to get is a little bit of a synthesis, but also through my own lens with regards to why I think about this problem this way, is what you're going to get from me today. So start agenda. I'll talk about, I'll talk about the special issue and the motivate, introduce myself, the health disparity special issue, the current state of evolutionary medicine, and then kind of a project. But really, it will largely be about the greater project of thinking about evolutionary medicine and health disparities. And my take, it's not my take, it's not everybody's take, it's just one of them. So, so some of you know me, this is who I am. I can be described as many things. I think evolutionary medicine is certainly one of the central kind of components to what I am as a scientist. I'm a student of the movement. I mean, in the early movement, I was trained at Yale, and under Paul Turner, right, who was certainly one of the, I think, that generation's big first hires who did that sort of work in a bold and direct way. And in my lab now, we use a mix of computation and other methods. And basically, we use diseases as systems to ask questions about evolution, information, ecology, behavior, and culture. Diseases are great systems, both because we want to use evolution to be able to understand and write them, and because when something breaks in nature, it kind of reveals how the actual structure of that system works. And so in two directions, disease and medicine end up being kind of useful frameworks for how I think about the world. And so more than that, we can kind of deconstruct my research program in terms of, not in terms of keywords, but in terms of like a creed. And that is, interactions shape biological systems. In my case, mostly in the setting of disease. These interactions shape how molecular evolution happens. And that's kind of the thing that I'm probably, that put most of the food on my table, is thinking kind of like evolution at the molecular level. They shape how epidemics manifest, and they also shape science, society, in the world in which they are embedded. And I think this last dimension is a growing component of what I am, and as we'll see, interacts with these other dimensions of my program. Right. And a lot of my work, I talked about, like a lot of my work is really about kind of how these interactions happen. Of course, a lot of you know what gene environment interactions are, or you say that there's, context. And one of the things about evolutionary medicine is the notion of mismatched diseases. That's a central concept. It's like you have an organism, you have an environment, and those things are out of touch with each other, or out of context. When we think about these contexts, of course, we can think about them various ways. In my research program, this is right. You can think about it. So, for example, we think about what is context. It's when you say this has been the best play I've seen all year. When you say something is kind of interpreted out of context, we can say something like, "Of course, it's the only play I've seen all year." And then this way, right? Right, you can kind of interpret this first part of the sentence, but it is out of context. And I think when and I think a lot of biology works this way. Similarly, this was a fantastic movie, as long as you aren't looking for plot or character development. And that is absolutely true for the last 15 years of Hollywood movies. But nonetheless, thinking about how context shapes how a system performs broadly, and then certainly in the case of disease, is really, really at the center. And so what are we talking about when we're talking about our systems? I'm looking, I see Charlie, I see Johnny, I see all these people. It's okay, you can turn your mic off, Charlie. I was just using you as an example. We all have different framings of the environment and context. Everyone, I can go down the line to all 7 million people that are on the call, and we would have a lot of different framings. So some of us live here. This is where a lot of my research program lives, kind of at the protein and molecular level. How does temperature influence the way this enzyme is performing its functions? How does evolution shape this at the molecular level? Some of you live at this level, which is kind of more of a systems ecology or climate change, how we're tempering. I mean, as we're seeing, unfortunately, in the world today, this slide has much different relevance today than it did even last week or a couple of weeks ago. I mean, we're in the midst of a really, really sad time when it comes to global change ecology. But it also means things like this, right? There's no New Yorkers. Johnny, where are you from? Are you from New York? Why do I think Johnny's from New York? No, he's not. Okay, I didn't think so. If there's any New Yorkers in the building, you might recognize this building. This is the Queensbridge houses, right? The Queensbridge houses is the largest public housing complex in the United States now, I believe. And of course, right, as we can see, there's a lot of biology going on. There's like trees growing and stuff, right? And of course, there's a field of urban ecology and evolution that interrogates this, that looks at how this works. But of course, when we think about the relationship between this structure and disease or biology, there's a lot of other things going on here, right? You have people living in a certain circumstance. And of course, this context that can influence kind of people's access to healthcare, the way diseases transmit, access to foods, and a lot of other dimensions wasn't the product of kind of, deforestation. This was the product of intentional decisions, right, made by people that look like this. Okay. And we can kind of trace this history of these places to decisions that are a lot like this. In fact, it's kind of the same. It just doesn't have the same name on it, right? Which is the perniciousness of the way these sorts of forces work in the world. So when we think about, right, what is context on all of our questions, I mean, there's 100 of these, whether you think about context and environment from a quantitative genetic or a physiological or a climatic or ecological perspective or a local or lived daily experience or some kind of historical or structural or psychological force, these things are all acting on our problems that we work on, right? We go around the room and perhaps you will see that at work, right? And so most of my work lives here, right? Like I said, I really think about drug resistance. And just in the last couple of years, we've done a lot of work about how context and environment is framing and shaping adaptive evolution, right? And how it influences epistasis, pleiotropy, and blah, 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 blah. I have that's kind of a big interest of mine, and how kind of theory has largely, I would argue, undertreated them, but maybe we can, I don't want to thump my chest like I'm, invented something. I think a lot of people have said this. In 2024, look out for a lot of work about virulence. I'm coming after the evolution of virulence. Right. So that's going to be in this framework. But the point is, right, this is kind of the crux of what I do. But I think there's other dimensions of this work where this manifests. I have an ecology of disease program, and I also have this science and culture program. And so in all of these things, they came to a head during the pandemic. And the way that I did my work primarily was engaging these contexts in the context of my public service work, right? I actually did not pivot my research program to become a molecular evolution of spike protein lab. We became a social engagement with people and trying to get them vaccinated lab, right? And that's what we were. And writing, of course, is where I do a lot of my work. I'm a columnist at Wired, and I'm a columnist at Quantum magazine, and I've written for the Atlantic. I write about ideas and structural change and systems dynamics, but I put them in a lot of different contexts. As great as all the scientific accolades can be, there's nothing better than a family that tells you that they got their entire family vaccinated because you were on a podcast. I'm going to tell you right now. So my point is, this is forever a part of my identity as a scientist. But this is the kind of thing that fed my understanding about how we can think about disparities. And so I gave a talk in 2020, some of you might remember. And in that talk, I kind of introduced 3 ideas. And I talked about these ideas about disparities. And I said, okay, it's kind of like the new tangled bank, the Darwin tangled bank. And what I said is, right, there are 3 things we can kind of do to address this. And I talked about some of the work that I've done. And I talked about kind of the interactions with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And I talked about the social moment we were in, the political moment we were in, and with interaction with the pandemic, and how that can influence how we think about biological systems. Now, 3 years later, right. I mean, and then this happened. This happened in 2020, and then this happened not long after I gave that talk. This was kind of the issue. This was the example that kind of all movements they need singular examples. And of course, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were examples of that. But I think in the context of disparities, right, I think many of you remember the Serena Williams pregnancy, which was this kind of very fascinating encapsulation of the way disparities work and the way she was treated, and the wealthiest woman athlete in the world, right, was treated in the hospital. But of course, this is the one that got me. Right. And this was a woman who was a physician and was discriminated against by her colleagues with regards to the pain that she was experiencing. And they treated her like she was an addict because, right, she was basically complaining of certain pain. And she died several weeks later. And I think when I saw this one, I said, OK, well, right, what kind of rigorous work can we do to really, really interrogate what's happening here? The reason why this is important is this happened at the time, right, when we were talking about disparities in COVID outcomes. We were talking about these disparate outcomes, right?
And so the idea here is, and so this became one of the examples, right, of what's happening. And the tragic thought experiment is this. This is sad because of Dr. Moore losing her life, but it's also sad is this thought experiment. If this is how they treat their medical colleagues, do I need to say the rest? Right? Imagine what the experience of the so-and-so average person is. And so in 2023, I kind of am picking this up, and I've like amplified this voice, and I'm trying to think about other ways. It's really more like 2021, I started thinking differently about this, which led to the conception of this this evolutionary medicine special issue. And I think a lot of these pillars remain. I want to engage ecology, diseases, nonlinear interactions, introduce new metrics, and understanding ethics in society. But this one here, diseases, nonlinear interactions between processes of information, is a pillar. And so for the evolutionary medicine special issue, I talked to another legend, somebody I have a great admiration for, Dr. Fatima Jackson. And we talked about maybe we need to kind of have a focus on this sort of work in the EvoMed community, in the EvoMed community. And really, there's 100 ways, right, to dice this. But I think we talked about various kind of ways in our editorial that kind of leads the issue. We talked about the types of forces that can influence disease outcomes and how inequality in these sorts of forces can manifest across them. And in this editorial, we say, right, when you're talking about the forces that are responsible for type 2 diabetes or COVID outcomes or addiction or what have you, the question of how much a health is caused by any one of the categories is ill-posed. The genetic, evolutionary, and social ecological forces work in combination, perhaps non-linearly, in crafting disparate outcomes. Meaning, if I want to understand, right, disparate outcomes, why populations are experiencing things, this is not a simple game of, it's not a simple jigsaw puzzle, which is the analogy we use to disentangle a lot of biological phenomena. It's much more complicated. Forces and things interact non-linearly, right? As in 1 + 1 may give you 4. The dimensions that Dr. Susan Moore was dealing with, being a Black woman, being a physician in a certain setting, right? It's not, you can't really disentangle those things. Those things are interacting with each other and help inform that poor health outcome. And this is something that we've leaned on, and I hope to animate in my own work. So my own work, and I think, I'll talk briefly about this today, very, very briefly, the introduction of new heuristics, methods, metrics, methods, and heuristics for kind of understanding. I'm a believer that if you want to understand something, you need kind of new ways to think about it and measure it. But this ends up being kind of the central dimension of how I think, but we could focus on this. And a lot of this goes back to my work in mathematical modeling. And in this paper here, we looked at hepatitis C virus, right? Which is, what's funny is we had done this work before the opioid use crisis actually took off. It was published right in the midst of the opioid use crisis disorder, which got way, thinking about context, way worse during the pandemic and since. Okay, to think about the way context in society can shape something. So it kind of hit at this point where we were basically saying there are better and more rigorous ways you can model diseases like hepatitis C that are affecting people who inject drugs. And what we did is we built this mathematical framework, right? And it's just trivial calculus, most of it. But I think what we did is we built kind of mathematically, we modeled an independent component of the model. We looked at needles, individual needles, right? And we looked at populations of needles. And the idea here is by looking at by modeling the needles as agents, you now have a better resolution for you to ask questions like, for example, how does the size of networks of people who are using drugs, how does the type of drugs that they're using, how does stigma, how does access to, for example, it's a very politicized issue, access to safe injection sites, access to needle exchange programs, access to these harm reduction things that are deeply political, how that can influence the dynamics of disease, right? And so this was kind of work that we published in 2019 that really put front and center this idea that what's happening in society, is it going to influence dynamics of various kinds? And so we followed up on this, right? Using mathematically, we followed up on this, but in a different context. The one piece of work we did do during this pandemic is we were early. This actually isn't right. Early. We were some of the people who were examining whether or not, remember we were all putting our pizza boxes in the oven and spraying down all of our Amazon boxes. Remember that era of SARS-CoV-2, right? When we thought it might be transmitted via fomite transmission, and I'm an expert on fomite transmission. And so we kind of asked the question of whether or not that's a likely route of transmission. Now, here's where it gets interesting. When we modeled it, we built this mathematical model. We modeled it, and we modeled it compared to, we basically looked at what our model did. W is the model that we built where you do have surface transmission. This is the one, SEIR, without it. And our model fits the data better. The surface transmission model fits the data better. Okay. Now, here's the thing, and this is intentionally a lesson. Doesn't that mean that if the model is fitting the data better, doesn't that mean that that's mechanistically probably what's going on? Well, no, of course not. We now know that that's not, or it's very, very unlikely to be. It's not a route of transmission for SARS-CoV-2, and that introduced me to this idea of identifiability. And I credit Joshua Weitz's work with really kind of bringing this to light. What he says in this paper, and it's about kind of what we worked on, which is direct and indirect modes of transmission in epidemiology. We show that models of direct and indirect transmission can produce quantitatively similar time series. So the idea here of identifiability is not about mathematical modeling. It's a statistical concept kind of that's much larger. The idea here is that distinct model structures can yield analogous dynamics. Multiple ways to skin a cat. Apologies to the veterinary people in the audience. Multiple ways to generate the dynamics of an outbreak. Meaning, you can have a neat and clean perspective on how a biological or disease phenomenon is happening. It could be completely wrong, right? Because there are multiple different types of models and such. And I couldn't help but think about the analogy between this and the health disparities. And so, right, when we look at the health disparities data, right, that has been, long for quite some time, we look at these data and if you remember what happened during COVID-19, the reason why this was surprising is that early on, it was centered in Southern Europe. Okay. And the narrative was one thing. It was like, oh, well, right, maybe there's something about Southern Europeans that are the problem, that are the reason why, right? Right. And to this tune, then it moved to the United States. And the minute it hit the United States, right, BIPOC populations were hit immediately. Bang. I mean, it went off and the rates were through the roof. And it began a set of questions as to what actually explains that. And so, right, y'all boy, Richard Dawkins said, why, right? And look, I do not, right? So he says, why the variable susceptibility to corona? Genes, future medicine, personalized, patient's genome on record, treated accordingly. Race is crude, present approximation. The 4-year-old study suggests European Neanderthal ancestry confers virus resistance. So Dawkins was saying, automatic when he saw these results, these two groups have distinct immune systems, which explains that finding. Okay. Now, I don't blame Dawkins for being wrong here, but what I did notice is the minute that there was a disparity by race for COVID-19, people ran for a genetic explanation. Sprinted. Pew. Right? And you saw this everywhere. Of course, what we found was the following. Oh. Well, sorry, pal. Actually, the opposite's true. Okay? It's actually, now we know the story's much richer now. There's actually genes that confer resistance, or decrease severity, and there's genes that increase severity because it works the way biology does, and a lot of genes do a lot of things in a lot of people. That's actually what the narrative is. Right. So there is no neat bundled genomic and genetic story for COVID severity. Right. What we actually have here is something much more complicated. Right. Much more complicated. So we can think about this in terms of a simplified dynamic. Here you have people who are susceptible getting exposed to disease, and green means that goes up. Here you have people who are symptomatic and are being denied care. These two forces create the same dynamics. Okay. Meaning, and both of these forces are where social determinants of health and health disparities manifest. People who had a higher exposure to disease communities had a higher exposure to jobs who couldn't work from home, like my fancy one. Those people had higher exposure to disease, and people like Susan Moore, who couldn't get proper care in the hospital, had higher mortality rates. So we actually saw, right? We can actually think about that as a thought experiment. We actually saw that happening. So, I'll end by saying we lack vernacular, and I'm going to use mathematical epidemiology as my example. We lack the vernacular to rigorously interrogate how forces that influence Susan Moore are influencing the dynamics of disease. There's a lot of nerdy stuff out there. Transmission coefficient, basic reproductive ratio, the force of infection, all these terms we've thought about for several decades, if not a century, depending on which term we're thinking about. But I've never read a paper that talked about how being denied access to care based on what you look like or what your gender is influences the force of infection. I've never read that study. I've never seen how discrimination at the bedside is influencing the basic reproductive. I mean, there's like a few, but like that's not true. I had never read one. There's a few out there, but there's a few. And so what I think is we need to think about this problem broadly. Evolutionary medicine should squarely engage these sorts of ideas to properly disentangle the tangled bank of disease. This is a dimension and a frontier for virtually every single health problem that we work on. And to close, I'll use the kind of out of context Darwin quote that we always must use, but this one I think is highly relevant, right? Great is the power of steady misrepresentation, but the history of science shows that fortunately this power does not long endure. The adaptationist program is a kind of just a part of evolutionary medicine, and I get that. I'm not trying to argue with everybody all day about that. I don't like it, right? But so we'll say that argument for another day. But what I think is when we sprint to neat and simple and bundled explanations for why Susan Moore's population has a higher mortality rate, and we trying to and you're doing genome scans first, I think that's kind of just an embarrassing lack of insight. And I think we need to, from the beginning, consider how forces like the social determinants of health, who has access to care and where, are really oftentimes the can be main actors in whatever disease phenomena that we're interested in. I'll stop there. Thank you for your time.
So if there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand or post them in the chat.
Right. Got Vaughn Cooper. We got all the people in the building. What's going on, Vaughn?
Cynthia, you have your hand raised.
I do. I agree with you completely about context and its importance for influencing outcomes. It's in my field in anthropology and biological anthropology. We try to measure context as often as possible, and it varies. Sometimes it's really crude. Sometimes it's precise, like altitude. And I think that if you could get people to do that, you could add those boxes into your models.
100%. And I think the thing that, I mean, I read a lot, I'm a huge fan of that field, and I've published in the journal, and I continue to read a lot of work. And I think, frankly, when it comes, anthropology is a study of human context. Is really what it is, right? I think it built that understanding. I think what's important, and I think what's important, and I'll just piggyback on what you said. This is why you need a lot of different people in a field thinking about what context is, right? So right? And I think so you think about the feminist anthropologists who walked into a lot of the early anthropology, were like, you didn't even ask what was happening with women in the society, right? You didn't even ask. People didn't even bother, right? And the idea there is you needed a population to raise their hand and be like, actually, this, and this may also contribute to the way the society is built, all right? That also is true. That's a theme. And I think this is also a theme here. Part of the reason why we don't have, I don't know how else to say this. Part of the reason why we don't have mathematical metrics to capture these things is because the people who wrote those models do not suffer the way Susan Moore suffered at the bedside, right? And so you need people to actually have a range of experiences in order to bring to life some of those contexts that are influencing. So I understand why Richard Dawkins, right, sprints where he sprinted, and I like a lot of stuff Richard's done, and I think we all do. So we're not saying anything bad. But that's not how, even though I'm trained in population genetics and mathematical epi, when I see that result, I don't sprint there because I've seen these forces operate right in my face. And so I think we just need to continue to get more minds and eyeballs on these problems, because there's things the disability community I'm reading about now. That's a privilege I've had my whole life. I haven't even thought about. For 20 years, I've been trying to get better in terms of my gender and my LGBTQ understanding, but there's still privileges I have that I don't see. That's just, I mean, and I think which is why those communities have taught me that there are aspects and things about, right, that influence the dynamics of my molecular evolution models, even, right? So if I build a model for like how drug resistance is happening, right? And that's pretty nerdy. I mean, this is stuff that me and Vaughn and several other, Vaughn's pioneered and, huge hero of mine. This is stuff that I think about at the molecular level, at the protein level, right? I'm thinking about how evolution's happening and how drugs are influencing even that. Do you think that how adherence to certain drugs, do you think that's influences by where people work and how people work and the access to drugs that they have? Of course it is. So even my molecular questions that I'm pulling out of society are influenced by these sorts of forces. So I completely agree, Editor-in-Chief Bell, and I appreciate the question.
Thanks.
There is a question from Leslie in the chat. Would you like to ask it yourself, Leslie?
Mm-hmm. Great question.
Sure. Hi. So thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I wanted to ask, based on one of your last slides, where you mentioned that we lack the formal tools we need to address social determinants of health. Mm-hmm. So what are the formal tools that we need?
Oh, piece of cake. No, I'm just kidding. So I can talk about the example that I talked about, right? So the answer, of course, is large. So I think there's two parts to that. Number one is how can the formal tools we need to study it and understand it, which is part of addressing it. And another one is like, how do you animate those at the policy level? That's another conversation. I'll talk about the first part because that's where I live. What we need is in the concept of infectious diseases, and what I'm trying to build is more granular. So let me go back to some classical models, right? You think about the HIV models. It was actually anthropologists who studied the men having sex with men community in certain places that were able to animate and properly parameterize what those early models for transmission, because it was a complete mystery, right? In terms of what was happening with HIV in certain American cities very early. It's a complete mystery. It wasn't until you had people who were members of those communities themselves and or had access to those communities that you were able to say, oh, okay, well, this is actually how it's happening. And so what it starts with is a more granular understanding of how society is structured in the context of COVID-19 disparities, for example. How society is structured, when we think about those arrows, those different boxes that I parameterize and with a number, then we already saw with Susan Moore, rates of bedside bias and discrimination are real. Those are real. We have actual data on those things going back 20 years. Those now need to be brought out, formalized into mathematical vernacular. And now, we need to build our models now with that sort of understanding. So rather than plugging everything into a susceptibility box that's supposed to account for the entire expanse, of, let's just say, the American experience, we need much more granular perspectives that capture some of those subtleties. Now, I think there are modeling tools that are kind of built to be able to do this, right? So some people say, well, just agent-based modeling, but it's not about what you code. Like that it's not no coding tool is going to do that. You have to have an understanding of what people are experiencing on the ground in order to properly get after it. A lot of you study mental health, right? Or depression. I'm gonna tell you right now, I'm gonna go ahead and guess there's very few of you over the age of 40 who have considered how gender identity is influencing mental health. That includes me. By the way, I just aged myself, but it is what it is. You know, there's very few you've had because that was not part of our conversation when we learned. What you needed is individuals from that community to demonstrate that that isn't actually an important dimension. The notion that that your biology is out of line with your identity, that's an experience I know nothing about, right? Or rather, like, I was raised to learn nothing about. I do educate myself. And so what I'm saying is, when you get those perspectives, they end up changing what our fundamental models of diseases are. And I mean fundamental models of disease. I mean the one in the molecular textbooks, in the medical textbooks. I'm not talking about hippy dippy tipster stuff. I'm talking about the central canon of how we think about disease transmission.
Okay, Vaughn, you had a question in the chat. Would you like to voice that yourself?
Sure, Joe, thanks. And I wrote it down because I wanted to see if I could, sometimes writing things down makes you think about it a little bit more carefully. Well, I mean, I guess I'm wondering if the effect, you showed how you can basically modulate two parameters in your model that would have the same apparent effect.
Yep.
I'm wondering if that's true in a comparative approach, because it seems to me denial of care operates at an individual level and would scale sort of linearly, whereas a transmission problem that's really a societal construct could have an exponential. Am I thinking about that correctly, or am I missing it?
Yeah, well, so let's dig it. I think that is grossly true, right? So in the so all right, watch this. Discrimination at the bedside is an individual actor thing. That's correct. And so that would change kind of that at a linear scale. But denial of health access to healthcare is not. That's
right.
actually a societal thing.
Yeah.
Right. So to this point about the interaction, Susan Moore had access to healthcare, right?
Yeah.
By definition, she had access to healthcare because that's what she does for a living. But the non-MD version of Susan Moore does not. And so, but here's the thing: when you think about that ladder arrow, individuals are getting both of those. They're both getting the denial of the treatment at the bedside, and they have inadequate access to healthcare, and they are working in jobs that, right, and they are burdened with having to take care of their grandma, and right. And so these things compile in these certain kind of ways. And so that was a thought experiment, right, for that reason. But I think mathematically what you're going to end up seeing is something much, much more complicated, but resolvable.
Right. I mean, I kind of would like to know how much of it, I mean, I'm getting nerdy here. I want to know how much of the disparity can be ascribed to the two factors, which is why I was suggesting if you did a comparative approach, like what Joe said in the follow-up, looking at sort of patterns of redlining within a known, within a well-studied environment, or across two different cities with good data. Could you just entail how much of it is just straight up?
I think we can get after pieces.
People were exposed because of their jobs.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why I haven't done that work is that I think the answer is more obvious than the effort in some ways.
I mean, I think it is.
But there are interesting questions in there, right? So, for example, one of the things I'm interested in, speaking about communities, the way the indigenous community was covered during the pandemic was embarrassing, right? Like we just know they didn't get any coverage about what was happening there, and all these fascinating dynamics we're having there. They both had the highest burden. Right. I mean, and of course, there's heterogeneity from nation to nation, but they had really, really high burden, but their vaccine uptake was really, really good.
Yeah.
Right. And so the idea there is, and look, I don't want to speak, like, if somebody from that community, please speak up. Right. So, but my understanding is, if there's a community that does not need to be taught about the perils of infectious diseases, it is that one. Okay. And that actually also goes for some of the things that we observed in Africa, right? So what I'm saying is, I guess what I'm saying, Vaughn, is I want to dig there, because I think there's a couple of knobs that, and they're relatively geographically isolated, relatively speaking. And so so that's a community I would like to dig into and get after some sub questions with regards to both the rates and the vaccine uptake and the way they structured, the way their leadership is structured in those communities, the way communication happens in those communities. I think there I want to chew on specifically because I think there's some things to learn.
Better idea. Yeah.
No, but just these are all
it is. It's
interesting.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I can interject, I mean, one of the areas where understanding historical factors such as redlining is also useful, also in chronic disease. So we have data showing, patterns of redlining in Greensboro that directly map on to asthma disparities in our community. And so one of the things we're doing in the precision microbiome engineering ERC is we are examining these formerly redlined communities and trying to determine the microbiome composition in homes and premise plumbing to take a look at what sorts of communities are existing there and whether these things could be actually playing a role in the differential asthma rates that we see in these communities.
Absolutely. No, I think that's and what I love about that project is it's the interaction. Like, I think there is a biological signature, right? It's just tuned with this deeply political and intentional dimension. And I think there's so many diseases in the evolutionary medicine suite, I think, that can be informed with a similar approach. What we got here? Okay. Yep.
So we have Charlie Nunn with his hand up.
Hey, great talk, Brandon. Really enjoyed that. One of the areas I'm interested in is climate change and health. And of course, climate change is going to generate all kinds of health disparities or accentuate health disparities is probably the better way to put it across, different populations and within countries. And I'm just wondering what your take on the current directions. There's a lot of funding. There's a lot of interest in this, in public health, medicine. I'm just curious about your take on where where people are headed with that and where you think they might be off on the wrong track. Where your perspectives, the things you shared today, the perspectives you shared today, might take it in a different direction or enrich the conversation in some way. What's missing in the standard conversation about this?
So there's a lot. I mean, it's a great question. And there's a lot there. So I too am doing some things with climate change and infectious disease. I think I'll make a general comment first, and then we can think about this with regards. I think any phenomena that is more likely to affect us, right, some people than others. Any large scale phenomenon is going to affect some people than others. You're going to see a health consequence. It's one of the powers of health is that it is a proxy for how society is doing as a whole, right? So walking that over into climate change, you're already seeing places like, we're already seeing the climate refugees. We're already seeing that happen. So when you have climate refugees, and it's going to happen more and more and more. Duluth, Minnesota is becoming like a bigger city because of climate refugees. First, it's probably going to be the wealthy people that are going to get away from these dangerous places because they have the resources to do so, and they're going to set up shop. Then you're going to have basically the last two things are going to happen. People who are in climate affected places are going to be suffering because the climates are changing, and that leads to the increase of various infectious diseases. But then when you have migrations in response to climate crises, they are now new populations in settings. They're now new populations. So not only do you have a climate problem that actually creates disease in the context of waterborne disease, in the context of vector-borne disease, you have another problem of nascent populations in places, and I don't got to tell this audience about mismatch. And not only mismatch, you have structural mismatch, like what me and Vaughn were just talking about, and right, which is now you have to build new infrastructure and you have basically the classical story of migrant populations and settings. So what I'm saying is I think there's a lot, and I think some of it is directly about climate. And other aspects are less about climate directly and more about what happens when populations are moving, which is a problem we've studied. Anthropologists in particular have done a beautiful job articulating for a century or so. So that's the quick answer, I would say. I don't know that literature too much. I've done some work on climate change and the rise of diseases like Vibrio vulnificus and stuff like that. You might have seen. So but I think the key answer there is that there's two halves of the problem. There's both how the direct climate influence on health, and then the indirect influence of climate on health because of the problems of migration. Does that make sense?
Yep, that's good.
So there is a question in the chat from Amy. Do you want to voice your question yourself?
Oh yeah.
Sure. Hi. So one of my major research interests is looking at health and path populations, so paleoepidemiology. And there's a real identifiability problem that's central at the core of that discipline that people call the osteological paradox. Yeah. And it's pretty much exactly the same identifiability problem, such a statistical issue, but we're dealing with, health disparities and causal models. And so I've seen you outline a couple of different ways to tackle identifiability. And so you said multiple diverse viewpoints of the researchers in the room to generate plausible explanations and get multiple formal models that can be applied to the same data set, right? And then you sort of mentioned agent-based modeling as an option, which is a direction I'm pursuing right now. But granularity of experience and understanding that stuff is important, and that might be our best bet in an archaeological context, because we can't actually get direct testimony from the people that we're studying. But I was wondering,
not here. It's amazing.
Questions for tackling identifiability as an issue in the discipline that I'm invested in.
So first of all, I'm going to answer your question, but before I get there, this is why I love this community, talking to this community, right? Like, I mean, now I'm going to go nerd out on, the osteological paradox. That's very, very cool. Second of all, I don't know. Third, I'm going to answer it anyway, because that's what men do. What I would think is, I think that in your case, I think you hit a lot of them, right? The idea there is, I'd have to get in the weeds of the problem to understand exactly what that is, but you hit on most of them. Agent-based modeling is really, really important because by that it just incorporates heterogeneity better, right? I mean, frankly, the original iteration, original kind of mathematical modeling is beautiful, and I'll defend it, right? But it is based on kind of an over homogenization of society, and I'm not going to politicize that. I'm just going to say it's a mathematical assumption of calculus, right? So let's not, But I think there are other modeling methods that can better interrogate that sort of diversity. But I think what would be exciting for is someone to write that paper, to actually think about the different problems in these different fields, right, that share this feature of identifiability. And it manifests in a lot of different fields. I just talk about mathematical epi. I mean, it's a general statistical problem, and kind of think about some examples of the way that they may or may not have been resolved. And I think maybe we can learn from each other, I guess is what I'm saying. And I think this is true for this is true for a lot. When you put multiple methods that people have thought about a similar problem similarly, or differently in a bunch of different fields, we oftentimes can learn from each other. So the number two is the answer is I don't know, but number three I think is if particularly is I don't know your problem, but I think that type of crosstalk between fields that have thought about this problem differently, perhaps there's things we can learn from each other.
Well, it's a really optimistic outlook to a pretty intractable problem. So
I mean, come on, yeah, we gonna be all right. I'm one of those people.
Yeah,
I'm not one of these academic grumps. I guess I am, but not like some of y'all, not like Joe.
Yeah, I was gonna say you obviously were referring to me.
Thanks, Brandon.
I see a hand up from Michelle.
Hey, Michelle Blythe here. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was really fantastic. I did have kind of a a question I don't necessarily expect you to fully answer, but I just kind of want to throw out into the universe. So I'm a physician, and I'm an academic physician, and part of my job is to teach the children's how to go about doing things. And with that, I that I am responsible for appropriately teaching a lot of concepts that you discussed. I just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on kind of some good ways to go about doing that, or some pitfalls in which people can fall into, at least in the academic medicine world.
Yep. So speaking of migrants, right? I'm a migrant from the medical community. In fact, I blame Joe for that. I blame Joe's talk for that. That's actually what got me. So I think when I was in the medical community, I thought about this quite a bit, and I was in the medical community in the early days when the Institute of Medicine report first came out, and there was like that big report about discrimination at the bedside. That the first big data, I think that was 2002 or something like that, or like in that era is when I was around. And so that's when like social medicine, I'm a child of the HIV/AIDS era, right? So like people like Paul Farmer and people like, and I was a much more of a global health person, that's another interesting conversation, is how generationally we've thought about these problems differently. What I will say, and to follow up on my being more upbeat than some people, is I think the medical community is awash in problems on this issue, as you know, which is why you're asking the question. But I think the conversations have been much more direct and honest there. Much more honest there. So in many ways, I've been pleased with what the conversations have been. I think now social determinants of health is taught in multiple kind of first-year curricula in a way it was not. Certainly, I think, I feel like every few months there's an interesting op-ed that's you heard about the GFR correction things that came out when it came to racial bias.
Yes. We sure to fix that in our EMR over here. So.
That's right. So I think medicine is having the conversation. I think as a instructor, and I'm sure you instruct on the wards. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm infectious diseases actually.
Oh, all right. Oh, right. Okay, we should keep in touch because because I began my career in medicine, all my graduate school friends are physicians, and they're infectious diseases. Many of them infectious diseases, and even though I'm not, and I'm saying this to say, when it comes to the individual kind of clinical education, one of the things I teach when I teach evolutionary medicine is the complicated dynamic between evolution is about populations, and the clinical encounter is about individuals, right? And I think navigating that relationship, for every time you say to yourself, oh, well, I know the literature says this, but I want to do this for this patient because I'm a nicer person and I understand right, that might actually be the right move. But I think what you want to introduce, or what the clinical instructors should introduce, is, we call it like yellow lights on thinking, right? You should think carefully about what a clinical decision is and what all of the different forces are that inform it. And so you're right. Should you rely on what the efficacy of drug X is in the literature, even though it wasn't tested on this population? In some ways, yes. In other ways, no. But you're bound to make the wrong decision clinically at some point. But you want to be thoughtful about the types of information you're integrating before you make that decision. So what I would say is, it's an information integration problem that happens at the bedside. You don't want people to be reflexive in either direction. You don't want to be reflexively, doing the thing that everybody should be doing for every wealthy patient in a Western nation, but you don't also want to be doing the thing where you're overly curating your care to the individual, because that, of course, is the recipe for discrimination at the bedside. So those things are oddly at odds with each other. And so I think so all we can do is think about it carefully. Gosh, that was a word salad, but I tried my best.
No,
yeah,
that's great.
So, Brendan, there's one last question in the chat that was put forward by Monica. So Monica, if you'd like to voice that, that would be the last question we do today.
It's a good one.
Are you still there, Monica?
I can read it.
Yeah, why don't you just go ahead?
How do you think language, y'all can see that? How do you think language barriers intersect here, specifically the gaps in research resulting from language differences? Is there a need for more multilingual researchers or models of interrogation to help tackle this and explore more inclusion approaches? Are the tools already available to address this? I mean, I think you answered the question. Speaking about privileges, that's a problem I don't have. That's not a problem anybody in my family has. I have, to that arrow that me and Vaughn were talking about earlier, right? Which was that the flux of individuals, right, from the disease state to recovered state, communication with healthcare is 100%. Not only is there discrimination against people who who have a language barrier, you simply can't properly to Dr. Blith will tell us sometimes you can't ascertain the information that you need in order to properly diagnose. So that's absolutely a dimension that I think is going to influence profoundly kind of the way and I use mathematical modeling as an example. It'll profoundly influence the dynamics of disease. What a great example, right, of something that I did not mention that absolutely is an actor in how disease outcomes happen, but it's nonetheless not a product of. It's kind of exclusively a cultural feature of some populations.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Ogbunu, for an illuminating presentation. And thank you all for the discussion and questions that followed. So, Johnny, do you want to quickly tell folks when the next EvMed is going to be so we can wrap up today's session?
Yes, yeah, thank you. So we have 2 more sessions as part of this theme with health disparities in evolutionary medicine. So they'll be for each of the next weeks, so respectively. So next week and then the following week, both on Wednesday at 12 o'clock Eastern time. And I will send reminders actually shortly after this so everybody can click on their links and register. But yeah, and as always, if you have questions, you can always email me anytime. And thank you so much, Brandon. That was really, really amazing.
Thank you all. Truly, really, what a great discussion. Please enjoy the rest of your week and try to do something nice for yourself.
Yeah, and then if there were any questions that weren't addressed, and I'm sure Brandon, you'd be willing to answer them if people sent you an email.
Totally. Please do. Please reach out.
All right. So thank you all for attending, and everyone enjoy the rest of their day.